A continent in flames, a government under fire. As Australia burns, the Prime Minister admits a link between reducing emissions and protecting the environment. But is Scott Morrison taking the climate crisis seriously? I'm Adnan Nawaz, and today's newsmakers are Australia's horrific bushfires. Australia's fires are so large they're generating their own weather systems. Since September, an area the size of Austria has burned, with smoke forming a plume half the size of Europe. More than 24 people have died, almost 2,000 homes destroyed, and 500 million animals killed. Prime Minister Scott Morrison has come under criticism for his handling of the disaster and for not taking the climate crisis seriously enough. 70% of Australia's electricity is still generated by coal. The government has virtually no plan to reduce that reliance and no policy to move, for example, away from petrol-powered cars. Australia is the only developed country in the world which is a deforestation hotspot. In a moment, we're going to debate whether the climate crisis has made the fires worse and if it's fair to blame the government. But first, here's a look back at a week described as hell on earth.
Oh my God. That, the end of road, I actually think that's all our bushes on fire right there.
It was always going to come one day, and the conditions now are dry everywhere, you know, we've got no chance, no water, nothing, so.
I'm only shaking your hand if you give more funding to our RFS.
So many people here have lost their homes.
We need some beds. We've got to have enough beds.
We need more help.
Well, I've always acknowledged the link, as has the Minister, between the broader issues of global climate change and what that means for the world's weather and the dryness of conditions in many places. But I'm sure you would also agree that no response by any one government anywhere in the world can be linked to any one fire event.
You from the media, tell the Prime Minister to go and get Nelligan.
Hell and back, but we're alive and yeah, the lucky ones, I suppose, in a sense.
Okay, let's go to the town of Sale in the southeastern state of Victoria. There we can speak to Jonathon Kendall. Jonathon, thank you so much indeed for joining us on the Newsmakers. I understand you had a bit of a nightmare recently. You were on holiday and you had to be evacuated because of an approaching fire. What was that like? Tell us about it.
Yeah, it was quite stressful, to be honest. We were on an island, Gabo Island, which is about 14 k's off Malakuta, which is in eastern Victoria. And when we went there was no fire at all. And then in the space of about a day and a half, fire had started and had taken hold. And I was basically trapped on an island with my family and two young children, my 1-year-old daughter and 4-year-old daughter, and we ended up having to get airlifted by the Navy off that island and evacuated home.
Yeah, we're seeing the pictures that you yourself recorded of that helicopter landing to evacuate your family. I mean, when you see the fires with your own eyes, how big are they? I know that in some places across the country, the local fire services have said that the flames have been reaching a height of 7 metres.
Yeah, huge. And when we were in the chopper on the way back home, we got a chance to actually look at the fire area, and it is just devastating. Looking at how much area this fire has burnt, it is huge. And when I say burnt, it's burnt right down to the water's edge, and pretty much nothing can survive it. I wonder about all the environmental damage, and I wonder about the damage to the, the flora and fauna. It's just unsurvivable, this fire, and some people have unfortunately lost their lives to it. Some people have lost their homes. When we saw it from the air, it was shocking. It was just very, very disturbing. This is a place that I love. This is my home. This is a region that I hold really, really dear to my heart. And the reason we live here is because we love the bush, we love the environment, and to see it destroyed is horrible.
How fearful are you of the future, Jonathon, in terms of what's going to happen and what's been forecast over the past 20 years or so seems to be coming to pass, and the projections are that things are going to get worse?
Yeah, well, I remember a couple of years ago reading reports about the frequency of drought, which is a precursor to fires like this. And we've been, this is the third year of drought in our region here in Victoria. And I remember reading this report and thinking, is this really going to happen? But I mean, it certainly seems to be happening now. We've got longer fire seasons, more intense fire seasons. The fires that we have are more dangerous, and as you can see from the pictures, they are devastating for people, for the environment, for our way of life. And so it certainly seems to be coming to pass what we've been told over the past few years, that droughts will get longer and more intense, and bushfires will get more intense and more dangerous.
It was just a few days ago that a senior official in the New South Wales Fire Service said even 10,000 firefighters wouldn't be able to extinguish the flames. What's the situation across Victoria right now?
We're in a bit of a lull at the moment, so we just have to look to the weather basically to see what's going to happen. I mean, with the dryness of the fuels, how dry the bush is at the moment, and the fires that are already in the landscape, as soon as we get a warmish day, so anything over 35 degrees, and as soon as we get a northerly breeze, which happens quite frequently in summer in Australia, those fires just take off. So the forecast for the next few days is not good again. So in about 2 days' time, we're going to get some northerly winds again and some hot temperatures, and these fires that are already there can really take off again. So people are starting to get really, really concerned about what's going to happen over the next few days, and we're only really, this is kind of the start of our bushfire season. But we've been fighting fires and dealing with fire since November, or even earlier than that. So traditionally, this is the start of our fire season, but we're going to have to be dealing with fires and intense fire weather for the next 2 months at least.
Jonathon, thank you so much for talking to us, and obviously from all of us, stay safe, you and the family. Take care. Well, let's look now at how Australia got here and how the government is handling the crisis. In Canberra, we have the climate scientist Mark Howden. Mark is the director of the Climate Change Institute at the Australian National University. Also in the capital, the former diplomat Tony Kevin, who was Australia's ambassador to Cambodia and Poland. And in the city of Brisbane, political consultant Graham Young joins us from there. Graham was the vice president of the Queensland Liberal Party. He's now the executive director at the Australian Institute for Progress. Gentlemen, thank you so much indeed for your time. Mark, let's start with the science, shall we? First of all, tell us how different this year's fires are from previous seasons. We understand that they're more ferocious this early in the season than they have been in the past. But is it also true that actually there's more forest burning this year than normal? Because quite often it's mostly bush that is burning, but forest is now burning as well.
Yeah, you're quite right. The area which has been burnt is unprecedented. So we're up to about 8.5 million hectares, which is about the area of Austria, or about the 10th of the size of Turkey. And so it's the area is burnt, but we've also seen really intense fires because we've had record high temperatures and record low rainfall in Australia. And so 2019 was quite exceptional in that respect. But as well as sort of the general area which has been burnt, we're starting to see new features of those fires, such as fire tornadoes, where we see tornadoes which are actually made out of flame, and they can vary from fairly small to very large, and they're extraordinarily destructive, and they can cause huge amounts of havoc. And we've also seen unprecedented air pollution in many of our capital cities. So we've seen really toxic levels of pollution in places like Sydney and Canberra. So there's a whole range of new things which are happening over and above what we've seen before.
And also there's the pirocumulonimbus clouds, those ones that produce their own lightning. Lightning strikes from those clouds had started 70 new fires about a week ago. Mark, how about the forecasts that were made years ago? In 2008, you'll probably know this, the independent study by the economist Ross Garnaut, who warned, and then here's the quote: "The weight of scientific evidence tells us that Australians are facing risks of damaging climate change." And the report said fire seasons will start earlier, end slightly later, and generally be more intense. This effect increases over time, but should be directly observable by 2020. I mean, that's prophetic.
It is. It's right on the money. And in fact, that the predictions for increased fire risk go back way before that. They go back 32 years, in fact, to the very first conference on climate change here in Australia. So consistently, the science has said that the risk is increasing, and it will increase further as climate changes more.
Okay, Mark, we'll return to the science as the debate continues. I don't obviously want to put you in a difficult position to make too many judgments that are based on the policies of this particular government. So let's expand that debate to our other two guests. Tony, is Scott Morrison not aware of the dangers posed by the climate crisis, or is he, in your opinion, fully aware but is not acting?
I think he became aware of them only in the last 2 weeks, which is reprehensible, really, because he should have been aware of them for all of last year. He's a very unsuitable person to be Prime Minister, in my opinion.
Graham, certainly Scott Morrison says ending coal exports risks Australian jobs. It probably almost certainly would. He says setting stricter goals to reduce Australia's greenhouse gas emissions would be reckless. But you're a defender of the way the Prime Minister has been handling the situation, are you, Graham?
Absolutely, yes. Let's just put the climate science to one side. There's a lot that you could argue about with what Mark said. For example, we've had more rain in the first 20 years of this century than we did in the first 20 years of the previous century. But let's just put that to one side and say, if Australia shut its entire carbon emissions down tomorrow, what difference would that make to the fires? And the answer is, it would make no difference at all. Australia emits somewhere around 1.3% of global emissions. The three largest emitters, which are China, the US and India, between them emit about 50%, and China alone increases its emissions every 6 months by as much as we emit each year. So Australian climate policy on its own can't have any effect on the climate in Australia. It's a global issue. That's why it's called global warming.
Yes, absolutely. Everything you've said is completely factually correct, Graham. But surely the point is not only to deal with the crisis as it is right now, which we can get onto, but is to make sure that Australia doesn't suffer in the future. And in terms of Australia's action on the climate crisis, there was a report published a few months ago called the Brown to Green Report, and there was actually an Australian who was the co-author of the report. It's sponsored by the World Bank, 14 governments around the world, and it says, without actually ranking Australia, that Australia has one of the worst responses in the world to the climate crisis. It's also true, is it not, with Scott Morrison's government as well as Tony Abbott's government. They're both full of climate deniers. They're backed heavily by Rupert Murdoch's media that doesn't want to push the climate crisis agenda. That's also all true, isn't it?
That's factually incorrect. Between 2007 and 2017, for which the international figures were available, Australia reduced its per capita emissions of CO2 by 12%. That put it, along with New Zealand, Canada, and other countries like that, the best performer was Norway, from memory, which was 40% per capita. But there were a lot of countries there that were increasing their CO2 emissions per capita. To say that Australia's dragging its feet is wrong. We're spending more per capita on renewable energy than any other country in the world. There are a lot of agendas being run out there, and a lot of them are political, they're not scientific, and they're not practical. Australia cannot be said to be a laggard in this area, or if you're going to say we're a laggard, then you ought to tag New Zealand, you ought to tag Canada, you probably ought to tag the US, Mexico, most of Europe as not performing. In fact, Turkey was a country that, from memory, actually increased its emissions per capita in CO2.
Okay, well, as far as I understand, when COP25 ended, pretty much with a watered-down final agreement, that meeting in Madrid in December, Australia came in for severe criticism. And while you're right in saying that Australia has been meeting its emissions targets, possibly even they're less than they could have been, it's because of carryover credits. And there's been a lot of criticism about that.
Well, you know,
yeah. Okay.
I'd like
Graham,
to think
okay.
that I get credit for what I've done in the past and that you do too.
Okay. Kevin, just give us an assessment about the governments that have been led by the more right element of Australian politics under Tony Abbott and under Scott Morrison in terms of the way they're approaching the climate crisis. And there are certain restrictions that come under the field of economics. Okay, renewables cost a certain amount of money. To make a dramatic change will have a negative impact on an economy in the shorter term. Clearly, the point is to save the planet for the future. But what does the government need to do now, and what is it not doing enough of?
Can I just correct something important in what has just been said? If you take into account Australia's huge coal exports, we're the largest coal exporter in the world, and our huge gas exports, we're the largest gas exporter in the world, we then become fifth ranking largest world polluter in terms of climate change gases. So to say that we're only a small contributor is simply incorrect. Now let me get on to your question. What Australia's got to do is accept the transitional costs, and Australians are ready to do this. Our industry's ready to do this. Our business sector, our workers, our consumers. The only thing that's holding it back is this infernal lobby group, which is well represented by our interlocutor here. It's a phony think tank. And what they do is they try to maintain a profitable position for what they're interested in, which is digging coal and energy resources out of the ground and selling them. They are pernicious people. They are a brake on the world's security, and frankly, they should be discredited and thrown out of the public marketplace of ideas at every possible opportunity. There is a huge goodwill in Australia to move forward on this now. The shock of what has happened and the way in which the Prime Minister has been discredited as an empty vessel, sort of a mouthpiece of the coal industry, he's now just floating along like a cork on the tide of public determination to move forward. We can do this. We are an ingenious people. We know technology. We like technology. We're moving forward enormously fast with renewable energy installations, both at small scale level and at large scale level. And all we really need, frankly, is for the federal government to, one, get out of the way in policy terms and let the people and the state governments and the local governments get on with it. And number two, get over their ridiculous obsession with balanced budgets. We are in a Keynesian situation here where we need deficit spending to get us over this hump. There's obviously going to be a huge amount of reconstruction to do in the next couple of years. There's going to be a huge amount of depression to prevent through deficit spending. And so those are the ways forward.
Okay, gentlemen, you clearly come from opposite sides of the political divide. You may not agree, it seems you won't, on how the government is handling the crisis. So let me just give you a quote from the independent report that was the Brown to Green report a few months ago. And the report said that there's a lack of policy in the Australian government. Its reliance on fossil fuels and rising emissions leave the country exposed economically, politically, and environmentally. Bill Hare was the Australian co-author of the report. He's the chief executive of Climate Analytics. And he says, again, it's a quote, the country is led by politicians who in one way or another deny either the science or are de facto denying it and actively and willfully oppose or obstruct climate policies. So let's return to the science for a moment. Mark, there are 4 categories that could explain the huge gap between what scientists like yourself say needs to happen. We're talking about a global level here, not necessarily only about Australia. What needs to happen according to the science and what is actually happening according to the politicians. So the 4 categories that are broken down are the complexity of the situation, the jurisdiction and accountability, and then there's collective action and trust, and there's imagination. So if we take jurisdiction and accountability, at what stage are we going to reach, and how quickly do you think we need to reach a point where ecocide is actually regarded as a crime? And will that help save the world? And your country being part of the world, but this is a broader question.
I mean, that sounds like it's an issue for international legal experts rather than.
But the point is, as
myself.
a scientist, would you like to see that happen?
Look, I think we actually do have all of the tools needed to make sensible decisions and move ahead on this issue. I don't think we need to create new categories of criminality to actually move this forward. What I think we have is in places like Australia and other countries, we actually do have the tools of government. We have effective policy making. We have effective responsibilities across different levels of government. We often have very effective information systems and response measures for disasters. And we have often a very capable public who can actually contribute to this. In our case, the volunteer firefighters are an example of that. So I don't know that we need to actually come in here with a big stick. What I think we do is need to have much better governance, much better organisation of the resources that we currently have.
Okay, Graham, the Prime Minister was invited back in July to meet with a specialist group of experts, the Emergency Leaders for Climate Action. That panel is led by the retired Chief of Fire and Rescue in New South Wales. The Prime Minister declined. Why would he decline?
Well, Tony just accused me of running a phony think tank. That organisation is backed by Tim Flannery and his Climate Council, which a lot of people would see as being phony as well. The Prime Minister has got good sources of advice. He's got the state governments, because this is not a federal government. The bushfires are not a federal government responsibility. They're a state government responsibility. He gets good advice from those people. And look, I think we've got to get back to the question here as to what we can do about the bush and what we can do about fires and what we can do about climate change. You can talk about ecocide all you like, but you are not going to arraign the Prime Minister, the President of China or the Prime Minister of India in front of some sort of international tribunal and have them hung, drawn and quartered. That's not going to happen. So we have to deal with the world as it is, which means you have to adapt. And when it comes to the Australian forest, there's a number of factors there, and the biggest factor in forest fires is actually fuel load. If it was just temperature, if an extra 1 degree of temperature was the difference between business as usual and cataclysmic bushfires, then somewhere like Saudi Arabia or Libya, which are the hottest countries in the world, would be tinder kegs. They're not, because they don't have the fuel. We have the fuel, we have the winds, we have the dry, and we also have the rain. So we have to look at how we deal with that. And since somewhere around 1919, there's been an increase in bushfires because of the way we manage the burning of forests rather. We've departed from Aboriginal traditions and techniques, which over 60,000 years turned this country into a fairly productive for them continent. And we've used techniques which have been less than ideal. So we need to go and we've got to look at how we deal with the tinder load that's there, the fire load, and manage that. And we also have to ensure that people don't live in areas where they're going to be at danger. You know, we have planning laws which say where you can live and where you can't live. We're allowing people to live right next to national parks, which in a lot of cases are not being kept properly by the states. They've got too many national parks, they don't have enough resources. Those sort of issues are the ones we've got some control over and which we should do something about.
Okay, Tony, we've got a minute left on the programme. I can give you the final word. Graham's had a long say just then.
Okay, well, on the day when people were dying And when 1,600 cottages were burning down, the Prime Minister was watching the cricket in Sydney, watching a fireworks display from his prior fireworks display, and urging people to stay calm. This is a man who doesn't know what he's talking about.
Okay, thank you for being brief, because that keeps us on time. Mark Howden, Tony Kevin and Graham Young, thank you very much indeed for spending time with us on the Newsmakers and discussing this crisis that is developing in your country. Just one final word for the viewer. According to a United Nations report, this was from the IPCC panel, it says we're facing economic damages of $54 trillion if the world gets 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer between now and 2040. And many scientists say we've already gone beyond the point of being able to keep temperature rises to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that is further food for thought as the planet faces a climate crisis. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.